twilight descends heavily upon the Dolomite Alps, casting long, jagged shadows over the valleys of South Tyrol. It is a humid, silent evening in May 1945. The war in Europe has officially ended. The guns have fallen silent, and the Third Reich lies in ruins, burying its thousand-year ambition under rubble and ash. Yet, in the mountain passes, the movement has not stopped. It has merely changed its nature. It has become stealthier, more desperate, and infinitely more secretive. Picture the scene at the heavy wooden gates of a Capuchin monastery near Merano. The air smells of damp earth and the faint, lingering scent of alpine rain. A figure emerges from the fog, a man in a tattered, ill-fitting civilian suit that hangs loosely on a frame accustomed to the sharp tailoring of a uniform. He carries no luggage, only the weight of a history he is desperate to shed. He glances over his shoulder, checking the empty road for the headlights of American jeeps or the patrols of partisans, before raising a trembling hand to knock. The sound echoes against the stone walls. Moments later, the heavy door creaks open. A monk stands there, his face obscured by the cowl of his habit. The stranger speaks a few words in German, hushed, clipped, laced with an unspoken plea. He offers no papers. He gives no real name. He does not need to. The monk does not ask for identification. He does not ask what crimes the man might have committed in Poland, in Ukraine, or in the death camps of the East. He simply steps aside and gestures into the gloom of the cloister. The stranger enters, the gate shuts, and he is led down a stone corridor to a modest cell. Inside, 3 other men are already waiting. They wear the same worn-out suits, possess the same haunted eyes of the hunted, and share the same silent understanding. They are safe here. They are under the protection of the church. This scene, played out in the quiet seclusion of Merano, was not an isolated incident. It was a drop in a vast subterranean river that would soon come to be known as the Ratlines. In the chaotic spring and summer of 1945, while the world celebrated the victory over fascism, a different operation was taking shape in the shadows. Columns of German officers, stripping off their insignia and donning civilian disguises, began the arduous trek across the Alps. Their destination was the sanctuary of northern Italy, specifically its monasteries and seminaries. They were fleeing the hangman's noose at Nuremberg, seeking a path to the oblivion of South America or the Middle East. Historians and intelligence analysts would later estimate that between 5,000 and 10,000 Nazi war criminals and collaborators successfully evaded justice using these routes. The term ratlines, borrowed from the nautical ladders used on ships, perfectly described the function of this network, a desperate climb to safety before the ship went down completely. But unlike a ship's rigging, these lines were woven from the threads of religious institutions. The infrastructure of escape was disturbingly robust. As early as 1947, declassified documents from American intelligence began to shed light on the startling reality of who was hiding behind the Vatican's walls. One specific report from that year detailed a discovery that shocked Allied command. Within the sacred confines of the San Girolamo of the Illyrian Seminary in Rome, intelligence officers identified the presence of 10 high-ranking members of the Croatian Ustaš government. These were not mere foot soldiers. They were the architects of a brutal puppet regime, now living, praying, and eating under the roof of a religious institution, shielded from the reach of international law. The complicity went beyond mere passive shelter. Rumors, persistent and detailed, circulated through the intelligence communities of Rome and Washington. There were whispers of black automobiles with Vatican diplomatic license plates, vehicles that possessed immunity from police searches, being used to shuttle fugitives between safe houses in Rome and their ultimate embarkation points. These cars, symbols of holy diplomacy, allegedly became the transport vessels for men with blood on their hands, moving them through checkpoints that would have otherwise meant their arrest and execution. Perhaps the most surreal and little-known aspect of this period was the bizarre coexistence within these sanctuary walls. The chaos of the immediate post-war era created paradoxes that defy fiction. In some monasteries, Jewish repatriates, survivors of the Holocaust, seeking a way to Palestine, found themselves sleeping in cells adjacent to Nazi fugitives. The priests and monks, driven by a complex and often contradictory interpretation of Christian charity, provided aid to both. To the clergy, a man knocking at the gate was simply a soul in need, regardless of whether he was a victim of the genocide or one of its perpetrators. This charity allowed the Ratlines to flourish. The silence of the cloisters became the greatest weapon of the fugitives. The network was not just a series of safe houses. It was a conspiracy of silence, protected by the crucifix. As the sun set on the ruins of Europe, the machinery of escape was already humming, greased by the strange bedfellows of religious piety and political pragmatism. The men waiting in the cell in Murano were just the beginning. The path from the Alps to the Pampas of Argentina was open, and the Vatican, whether through willful blindness or active participation, held the keys to the gate. The prequel, How the Vatican Prepared for the Post-War Chaos, 1942-1944, long before the swastika was torn from the Reichstag and the Third Reich crumbled into dust. The machinery of salvation was already quietly humming within the neutral enclave of the Vatican. The popular narrative suggests that the escape routes were a frantic, improvised reaction to the collapse of Germany in 1945. The reality, hidden within diplomatic cables and private audiences, is far more calculated. The Vatican was not merely reacting to history, it was preparing for the aftermath. The foundations of the Ratlines were laid years before the final surrender. As early as 1942, while the war was still raging across Europe and the outcome remained uncertain, the Holy See began looking toward the horizon. Cardinal Luigi Maglione, acting under the direct instruction of Pope Pius X, initiated a series of discreet communications with the government of Argentina. The subject was sensitive: the reception of future immigrants. On paper, these discussions were framed in the language of humanitarian concern. The Church sought a haven for Catholic refugees who might be displaced by the conflict. However, the definition of who constituted a refugee was intentionally broad. The groundwork was being laid for a transatlantic bridge that would eventually carry thousands of Europeans away from the ruins of the old world to the safety of the new. By 1944, as the Allied forces closed in on Fortress Europe, the Vatican institutionalized this support network. The Pontifical Commission of Assistance, PCA, was established. Its official charter was unimpeachable: to provide food, shelter, and spiritual comfort to the countless victims of the war. It was a beacon of charity in a darkened world. Yet, in practice, the PCA became a dual-use structure. While it undoubtedly helped innocent civilians, its resources and logistical capabilities effectively provided cover for Nazi sympathizers and collaborators. The cloak of charity was large enough to hide a multitude of sins. At the center of this shadowy preparation stood a figure of immense influence and controversial intent. Bishop Alois Hudal, an Austrian by birth and the rector of the Collegio Teutonico in Rome, Hudal served as the spiritual director of the German community in Italy. His loyalties were complex, but his actions were decisive. Beginning in 1944, Hudal became a frequent visitor to prisoner of war camps in Italy. Dressed in his episcopal robes, he moved among the captured soldiers, offering solace and sacraments. But he was doing more than saving souls. He was curating a list. Hudal was actively identifying and selecting men he deemed anti-communists. In his eyes, these were not criminals to be judged, but assets to be saved. Hudal's network was international and sophisticated well before the war's end. He was not working in isolation. Historical records reveal that he was already coordinating evacuation plans through Spain, collaborating with key figures of the European far right. He maintained contact with Pierre Daye, a Belgian fascist, and Charles Lescat, a French collaborator. Together, they mapped out routes and safe harbors, ensuring that when the dam finally broke, there would be a channel ready to direct the flood. The driving force behind this preparation was not necessarily a love for Nazism itself, but a profound, paralyzing fear of what lay to the east. The Vatican's geopolitical compass was magnetized by the threat of Soviet atheism. In the corridors of the Apostolic Palace, a cold logic began to take hold long before 1945. The church hierarchy viewed the conflict through a different lens than the Allies. To them, the Soviet Union represented the ultimate existential threat to Christianity. In this worldview, the Nazis and their collaborators, despite their pagan excesses and brutality, were increasingly seen as the lesser of two evils, a bulwark against the red tide. The logic of the Cold War did not begin with the Iron Curtain speech. It began here, in the years between 1942 and 1944. The infrastructure built by Maglione, the PCA, and Bishop Hudal was designed to save the soldiers of the anti-communist crusade. They were preparing for the next war before the current one had even finished. And in doing so, they ensured that the perpetrators of the Holocaust would find a sanctuary in the shadow of St. Peter's. 1945, the first escapes across the Alps. The silence that fell over Europe on May 8, 1945, following the unconditional surrender of the Third Reich, was deceptive. While the guns had ceased firing, a frantic, silent migration was just beginning. In the weeks immediately following the capitulation, a human tide of thousands of Germans, Austrians, and collaborationists surged southward. They moved not as conquering armies, but as fugitives, seeking the jagged protection of the Alpine passes. The mountains of South Tyrol became the first great filter. As the Allies celebrated victory, the monasteries in towns like Bressanone and Merano were quietly transforming into logistical hubs. These religious houses, nestled in the picturesque valleys, ceased to be mere centers of contemplation. Instead, they became way stations, processing centers, where the defeated could catch their breath, shed their uniforms, and prepare for the next leg of their journey into the Italian peninsula. By late summer, the focus of this underground railroad had shifted to the heart of Rome itself. In August 1945, American intelligence officers made a startling discovery that exposed the depth of the Vatican's involvement. Their investigation led them to the Pontifical Croatian College of St. Jerome, San Girolamo degli Illirici. What they found was not a house of prayer, but a fortified sanctuary for the shattered remnants of the Croatian Ustaše regime. The operation at San Girolamo was run with military precision by a man who would become legendary in the annals of espionage. Father Krunoslav Kruno Draganović, a Croatian priest with a sharp mind and ruthless efficiency, Draganović was the architect of the Ustaše evacuation. Under the very noses of the Allied occupation forces, he orchestrated the survival of some of the war's most brutal figures, including the Ustaše leader himself, Ante Pavelić. Draganović was an enigma. While he utilized the sovereignty of the Vatican to shield his compatriots from justice, there were shadows within shadows. Rumors and fragmented documents from the era suggest a complex reality. As early as 1945, Draganović was not merely hiding from the victors, but may have already been in contact with American intelligence services. In the burgeoning logic of the Cold War, a man with Draganović's connections was a valuable asset, and the line between enemy and informant began to blur almost immediately. The mechanism of escape was visceral and intimate. Picture a narrow cobblestone street winding behind the massive dome of St. Peter's Basilica. The air here is heavy, carrying the distinct mingling odours of Roman dampness and church incense. It is late at night. A heavy wooden door creaks open, revealing the dark maw of a basement beneath the seminary. A man in a black cassock steps out, checking the alleyway with practiced caution. He ushers 3 men out of the shadows figures who have spent days or weeks in the subterranean gloom of the college. They blink against the street lamps, clutching their chests. The priest hands each of them a small, nondescript packet. Inside, there is salvation, a falsified passport and a train ticket to the port of Genoa. No words are exchanged, no blessings given aloud. The transaction is complete. The men vanish into the Roman night, ghosts on their way to a new life, leaving their crimes buried in the archives of the seminary behind them. 1946, 1947, the conveyor belt of false papers. By the middle of 1946, the desperate ad hoc scrambles through the mountains had evolved into something far more sinister, a streamlined, bureaucratic machine. The escape route was no longer a path of chance. It was a conveyor belt, efficiently processing the wreckage of the Third Reich and spitting it out onto the shores of South America. The scale of the operation was becoming impossible to ignore, even for the slow-moving wheels of international diplomacy. By July 1946, the US State Department had officially noted that at least 9 high-profile war criminals were residing comfortably under church protection. But the true scope was revealed in the winter of the following year. In February 1947, an agent of the Counterintelligence Corps, the precursor to the CIA, Robert Mudd, filed a report that was as detailed as it was damning. Mudd's dispatch confirmed that 10 members of Ante Pavelić's cabinet men who had orchestrated the genocide in the Balkans were living within the Vatican's orbit, shielded by the sovereignty of the Holy See. The system operated with the rhythm of an industrial assembly line. The trajectory was standardized. A fugitive would arrive at a monastery or seminary. From there, they would be directed to obtain a specific piece of paper, a Red Cross travel document. Finally, armed with this new identity, they would board a ship at the port of Genoa, bound for the welcoming harbors of the Southern Hemisphere. The linchpin of this entire operation was the laissez-passer issued by the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC. These travel documents were the golden tickets of the post-war era. To obtain one, a stateless person needed a reference. This was where Bishop Alois Hudal played his masterstroke. Hudal turned the issuance of these documents into a mass production enterprise. He issued letters of recommendation on official stationery, vouching for the identity of the refugees. Sometimes he signed them himself. Other times, he simply forged the necessary signatures. The volume was staggering. It is estimated that up to 120,000 such documents were processed through these channels by 1951. The tragic flaw in the international system was trust. The Red Cross, overwhelmed by the humanitarian crisis of millions of displaced persons, operated on a presumption of good faith. They did not have the resources, nor perhaps the will, to investigate every applicant. When a high-ranking Catholic prelate vouched for a man, the Red Cross officials did not question it. They trusted the cassock. They believed that a priest would not lie. Because of this blind spot, the monsters of the 20th century were able to walk through the front door. This system provided the papers for Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the final solution, for Josef Mengele, the angel of death of Auschwitz, and for Franz Stangl, the commandant of Treblinka. They did not sneak onto ships in the dead of night. They boarded them with stamped official papers, procured through the recommendation of the Church. Bishop Hudal never repented for this industrial-scale deception. Years later, in his memoirs, he offered a chilling justification that perfectly encapsulated the warped morality of the Ratlines. He wrote, "I felt it my duty to help those victims of persecution, those who had fought against Bolshevism." In his eyes, the men who had built the gas chambers were not criminals, but victims of a political witch hunt, martyrs in the crusade against communism. 1948, 1950s, Argentina, the promised land for Nazis. The trajectory of the Ratlines did not end at the docks of Genoa. It spanned the Atlantic to find its terminus in the southern hemisphere. If Rome was the airlock, Argentina was the new world. Under the presidency of Juan Perón, the South American nation became the promised land for the wreckage of the Third Reich. Perón effectively threw open the gates of his country, allowing approximately 10,000 Nazis and fascists to vanish into the vastness of the Pampas and the anonymity of Buenos Aires. From 1948 onwards, the trickle of fugitives turned into a steady stream. The timeline of arrivals reads like a roll call of infamy. Ante Pavelic, the butcher of the Balkans, arrived in 1948. Josef Mengele, fleeing scrutiny in Europe, stepped onto Argentine soil in 1949. Adolf Eichmann, the logistician of the Holocaust, followed in 1950. They did not arrive as invaders, but as guests. Perón's hospitality was not merely a passive act. It was a defiant ideological stance. The president made no secret of his disdain for the Allied attempt at justice. He publicly denounced the Nuremberg trials, branding the proceedings a disgrace and a rape of justice. In Perón's view, the victors were exacting vengeance, not law. However, beneath the rhetoric of sovereignty and anti-imperialism lay a colder, more pragmatic calculation. Perón envisioned a modern, industrialized Argentina, and he saw the fleeing Europeans not as war criminals, but as a reservoir of technical expertise. He needed engineers, scientists, and military strategists to build his new Argentina, and he was willing to overlook the blood on their hands if they could help build jet fighters or nuclear power plants. Ideology was significant, but utility was paramount. Yet, as history often reveals, there was also a price tag attached to this sanctuary. A staggering revelation brought to light by documents released by the Argentine government in 2025 exposed the financial currents beneath the political waves. These archives detailed that approximately $200 million worth of Nazi gold had been funneled to Perón's regime. This wealth, laundered through the secretive vaults of Swiss banks like Credit Suisse, was the currency that bought safety. The Ratlines were paved not just with good intentions, but with stolen bullion. The reality of life for these fugitives in Argentina was often bizarrely mundane, a stark contrast to the apocalyptic crimes they had committed. The most surreal example was that of Adolf Eichmann, the man who had organized the transport of millions to the gas chambers. Did not live as a grand villain in a mountain fortress. Instead, he settled in a dusty suburb of Buenos Aires under the alias Ricardo Clement. There, stripped of his uniform and his power, the bureaucrat of death found a new vocation. He became a farmer, quietly raising rabbits. The man who once managed the logistics of genocide spent his days tending to fluffy animals, a grotesque tableau of the banality of evil. The Dark Alliance, the Vatican, the CIA, and Klaus Barbie. By 1951, the moral clarity of the Allied victory had dissolved into the murky grey fog of the Cold War. The hunt for justice was being quietly replaced by the hunt for assets. The Ratlines, once a mechanism of escape, were repurposed into a tool of geopolitical strategy. In this new era, the interests of the Vatican, American intelligence, and fugitive Nazis converged in a dark alliance that would stain the history of the post-war world. The most notorious example of this collaboration was the case of Klaus Barbie. Known as the Butcher of Lyon, Barbie was a man whose sadism was legendary. He was responsible for the torture and murder of thousands of French resistance members and Jews. Yet, to the emerging American intelligence apparatus, Barbie was not a monster to be hanged, but an anti-communist specialist to be utilized. In 1951, American intelligence services, the precursors to the modern CIA, made a calculated decision to evacuate Barbie from Europe before French authorities could extradite him. To do this, they did not build a new escape route. They rented an existing one. They turned to the master of the Roman underground, Father Krunoslav Draganovich. The operation revealed a cynical symbiosis. The CIA effectively hired the priest as a travel agent for war criminals. Documents reveal that US intelligence paid Draganovich for his services in transporting valuable assets like Barbie. The Ratline was no longer operating solely on religious charity or ideological sympathy. It had become a service provider for the Western powers. Barbie was funneled through the established channels, the safe houses, the false papers, the port of Genoa, and sent to Bolivia. But unlike Eichmann, who sought anonymity among his rabbits, Barbie did not retire. In Bolivia, he found a regime that valued his particular set of skills. The butcher resumed his trade, working for the Bolivian military dictatorship. He became a consultant to the security forces, teaching local death squads the torture techniques he had perfected in the cellars of the Gestapo headquarters in Lyon. Throughout this operation, the Vatican maintained a posture of plausible deniability. Officially, the Holy See distanced itself from the sordid business of espionage. However, the institution did not intervene. The silence of the hierarchy was deafening. By allowing priests like Draganovich to operate with impunity, and by permitting the use of church resources for these covert transfers, the Vatican's passivity morphed into active complicity. The logic of the Cold War had eclipsed the verdict of Nuremberg, and in the shadows of the altars, the Americans and the priests shook hands over the safety of a monster. Did the Vatican know? The historians debate. The question that hangs over the entire history of the Ratlines is one of culpability at the highest level. What did Pope Pius XII know? Was the escape network a rogue operation conducted by fanatical clerics acting on their own initiative, or was it a sanctioned policy of the Holy See? The archives offer a murky picture, devoid of a smoking gun, but rich in damning ambiguity. To date, no document has been found that contains a direct order from the Pope to organize the escape of war criminals. There is no directive bearing the pontiff's seal that explicitly authorizes the smuggling of Nazis. However, the indirect evidence points to a disturbing level of awareness within the Apostolic Palace. The Vatican is, by design, one of the most hierarchical institutions on earth. The idea that thousands of fugitives could pass through its institutions without the knowledge of the hierarchy strains credulity. A key piece of evidence in this puzzle involves Giovanni Battista Montini, the substitute for general affairs, and the man who would later become Pope Paul VI. Historical records show that in 1950, Montini expressed fury regarding the brazen nature of Bishop Hudal's activities. The pressure from the top was significant enough that Hudal was eventually forced to resign from his post. On the surface, this looks like an act of cleansing a rejection of the Ratlines. However, the context suggests otherwise. While Hudal was removed, the infrastructure he helped build did not shut down. The operation simply shifted hands. Father Draganovic continued his work with the Croatian fugitives, and the routes remained open. This has led many historians to conclude that Hudal's dismissal was not a moral condemnation of the rescues themselves, but a punishment for his lack of discretion. He had become too visible, too embarrassing. The prevailing theory among scholars is that Pope Pius IV was likely aware of the general scope of the operations, but chose to turn a blind eye. The motivation, once again, was the paralyzing fear of the East. In the Vatican's calculus, the fight against communism was the supreme moral imperative. If saving the remnants of the Nazi regime could help build a bulwark against Soviet atheism, then silence was deemed a necessary sin. The debate remains polarized. Catholic apologists maintain that the Ratlines were initiatives from below, acts of misguided charity by individual priests that did not reflect official policy. They argue there are no documents proving an official Vatican policy. Yet, the counter-argument is formidable. American intelligence reports from as early as 1946 and 1947 explicitly named the Vatican as an institutional sanctuary. These reports were not secrets, they were diplomatic realities. It is difficult to argue that the Vatican was ignorant of what the US State Department already knew, that the shadow of the cross was hiding the men who had set the world on fire. Legends and conspiracy theories. Did Hitler escape? While the Ratlines were a verifiable historical reality, their existence gave birth to a shadow world of myth and fevered speculation. If Eichmann, Mengele, and Pavlich could slip through the net and find sanctuary in South America, the public imagination began to ask the ultimate question: what about the Führer himself? For decades, the ghost of Adolf Hitler haunted the collective consciousness of the post-war world. The rumors were not merely the stuff of tabloids. They reached the highest levels of intelligence. Declassified files reveal that the FBI and the CIA took these whispers seriously enough to maintain active investigations into the 1950s. Agents were tasked with chasing down leads and sifting through reports until as late as 1955, driven by the terrifying possibility that the architect of the Third Reich had somehow cheated death. The epicenter of these legends was inevitably Argentina. Between 1945 and 1950, the South American press fueled the hysteria. Newspapers in Uruguay, Brazil, and Argentina frequently published sensational eyewitness accounts. These stories painted a picture of a secluded life in Patagonia, where the landscape bore a striking resemblance to the Bavarian Alps. Readers were fed tales of a brooding, aging dictator living in a fortified compound, gazing out over the Andean lakes, plotting a Fourth Reich that would never come. The hysteria often descended into the absurd. One particular anecdote from this era perfectly illustrates the mixture of paranoia and mistaken identity that gripped the region. A witness came forward with a detailed report of seeing Hitler in the resort town of Bariloche. The testimony was specific. The man had the iconic mustache, spoke German with a heavy accent, and was seen working in a Bavarian-style pub. The intelligence services investigated only to find the mundane truth. The Führer was, in fact, an Austrian immigrant, a simple brewer who bore a passing physical resemblance to the dictator and had the misfortune of keeping a similar style of facial hair. Despite the allure of these conspiracies and the ink spilled by fantasy writers, the historical verdict remains cold and absolute. All theories of escape have been comprehensively refuted. Adolf Hitler did not board a submarine to Antarctica, nor did he find shelter in an Argentine hacienda. His journey ended on April 30th, 1945, in the claustrophobic concrete of the Führer bunker in Berlin, where he took his own life. The legends of his survival were merely a projection of the world's fear, a fear nurtured by the very real fact that so many of his henchmen had, indeed, managed to get away. Legacy, money, gold, and Swiss banks. The infrastructure of the Ratlines was built on fanaticism and political calculation, but it was fueled by something far more tangible: gold. An operation of this magnitude moving thousands of men across oceans, procuring false documents, paying bribes to border guards, and establishing new lives in South America required immense capital. The Nazis did not flee empty-handed. They took the plundered wealth of Europe with them, and the financial institutions of neutral Switzerland served as the silent conduits for this theft. For decades, the banking secrecy laws of Switzerland were impenetrable. Institutions like Credit Suisse and the Swiss Bank Corporation presented themselves as neutral vaults in a turbulent world. In reality, during the crucial years of the Exodus, they acted as the laundromats for the Third Reich. They accepted the deposits of the fleeing regime and obscured the trails of ownership, shielding the accounts from the prying eyes of post-war investigators until the scandals of the 1990s finally forced the doors open. The provenance of this wealth adds a layer of horror to the financial transaction. While much of the gold was looted from the central banks of occupied nations, a significant portion had a far more personal and gruesome origin. This was not merely stolen bullion. It was blood money in the most literal, visceral sense. Historical analysis has confirmed that part of the gold reserves funneled through these accounts was derived from the victims of the concentration camps. It was gold melted down from wedding rings, torn from the fingers of the dead, from family heirlooms, and most chillingly, from the gold teeth extracted from the mouths of those murdered in the gas chambers. This macabre currency was processed, purified, and then used to pay for the steamship tickets and safe houses of the very men who had ordered the extraction. The murderers were retiring on the savings of their victims. The silence of the Swiss banks held for half a century. It was not until the late 1990s, under immense international pressure and facing the threat of crippling sanctions, that the wall of secrecy began to crumble. The revelation of dormant Nazi accounts triggered a global scandal. In 1998, in a historic admission of institutional complicity, Swiss banks agreed to a settlement of 1.25 billion. This sum was paid as compensation to the victims of the Holocaust and their heirs, a belated monetary acknowledgement that the neutrality of the Alps had been bought with the gold of the dead. Conclusion: silence as complicity. The physical structures of the Ratlines have long since dissolved. The monasteries of South Tyrol have returned to their quiet rhythms of prayer and contemplation. The port of Genoa is no longer the gateway for fugitives, and the men who walked the monastery route, Eichmann, Mengele, Pavlich, Barbie, are all dead, their fates sealed by history or the grave. Yet the moral shadow cast by these operations remains as long and dark as ever. To this day, the Vatican has not issued a formal, specific apology for the existence of the Ratlines, while the Church has expressed remorse for the failures of Christians during the Holocaust. In general terms, the institutional machinery that allowed mass murderers to escape justice remains a subject of careful diplomatic silence. In March 2020, a significant step was taken toward transparency when the Vatican officially opened the apostolic archives of the pontificate of Pius X. For historians, this was a watershed moment, offering the hope that the black legend of the wartime pope could finally be adjudicated with hard evidence. However, the initial findings have not provided a simple exoneration or a total condemnation. Instead, the full picture remains fragmented and elusive, obscured by the vastness of the documentation and the complexity of the era. The interpretation of these events reveals a tragic paradox. The Church found itself caught between two fires. On one side burned the imperative of Christian humanism, the theological duty to offer sanctuary to the defeated, the refugee, and the outcast. On the other side lay the cold reality of the crimes committed by these refugees. In trying to navigate this divide, the Church allowed its virtue to be weaponized. Mercy, intended as a balm for the suffering, was transformed into a cloak for the guilty. By prioritizing the salvation of the anti-communist soul over the justice due to the Jewish victim, the logic of charity collapsed into complicity. The story ends not in a courtroom, but in a quiet room of study. Picture the scene deep within the Vatican Apostolic Archive. The air is climate-controlled, dry and still. On long rows of metal shelving rest stacks of yellowed folders, their edges brittle with age. A researcher's gloved hand reaches out to open one. The paper inside is thin, covered in the precise typed script of the 1940s. Stamped across the top in fading ink are the words "strictly confidential." These files hold the names, the dates, and the decisions that shaped the post-war world. They are the silent witnesses to a time when the gates of salvation were open to the agents of hell stories that the world is only just beginning to read and perhaps will never fully understand.